If everyone can take their seats, we're going to get started. I first want to welcome everyone here to our launch of the America's Quarterly Social Inclusion Index. We are so happy to be partnering with the State Department and to have the Assistant Secretary of Western Hemisphere Affairs, Roberta Jacobson, here with us this morning. We graciously want to thank the Seattle International Foundation and Mauricio Vivero for being here and supporting this index year over year. Thank you to all of us joining on webcast, and thanks to our webcast sponsor, Telefonica, and also to HSBC, who supports generously the America's Quarterly magazine throughout the year. We're really excited to be partnering with the State Department for this event. We have typically partnered with the social inclusion team under the leadership of Zakiya Johnson for years, just in terms of stopping by their offices and briefing everyone on our social inclusion index results. And this year, we're really happy to be having a more formal partnership in the launch event, because the State Department is really doing great work throughout the region to promote policies of social inclusion in our various offices throughout the Western Hemisphere. So I'm going to turn it over right now to the Assistant Secretary of State, Roberta Jacobson. Instead of Susan speaking first, she'll then, when she arrives, she'll give her remarks after Roberta, and then we'll have a great panel discussion. So I want to turn it over right now. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Alana, and thanks to all of you for being here today. We just roll with it in Washington. You can never tell when the flights are going to get here, when the cabs are going to get here, so we just keep moving. I really am delighted that everyone's here today. For me, this is a particular pleasure because I have really regarded the Social Inclusion Index each year as a very important reminder to policymakers of something we too often forget when we look at macro numbers. And it is a reminder that in the end, the macro numbers and the policy and everything we do is about human beings, it's about people, and sometimes those big numbers or positive policies can hide some real problems that persist. So I'm delighted to be here and do my part, if I can, to highlight the great work that the American Society, Council of the Americas, and America's Quarterly has done each year in promoting recognition of where we're making progress and where we aren't in social inclusion. And I think that it really has been invaluable to all of us. For this administration, we focus a lot on expanding trade and creating jobs, both in the United States and in the hemisphere. So whether it's our efforts on cross-border trade, or whether it's the efforts on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, you see this in many of our programs. But none of our efforts towards growth will be sustainable unless they are socially and economically inclusive. I spoke yesterday at the 19th Annual CAF, Latin American Development Bank Conference, about one deep and abiding bar to equitable growth in the Americas, and that was corruption. But we know that persistent discrimination is still an obstacle to social and economic inclusion, and that is holding this hemisphere back. The department supports initiatives that engage historically marginalized groups and address the underlying causes of inequality by improving access to justice, services, and economic opportunity. The Western Hemisphere Bureau at the State Department created the Race, Ethnicity, and Social Inclusion Unit in 2010 under the really able leadership of Zakiya Johnson to better focus our efforts and to give ourselves a single point of reference for all of the disparate areas that we wanted to work on. And the America's Quarterly Social Inclusion Index similarly puts it all together, looking at a wide and varied set of factors to measure how societies and governments treat their people. No one has really done that before in such a high-profile way, and we're especially pleased that this year's index features a new ethno-racial indicator to measure the inclusion of African descent and indigenous peoples. That seems to me a particularly appropriate thing this year because it is the UN's International Decade for People of African Descent, which kicks off this year from 2015 to 2024. And I want to particularly note that we've been grateful for Colombia's leadership on the UN resolution on that subject. In the United States, the International Decade allows us to reflect, frankly, both on accomplishments in this country on the issue of people of African descent and on the very many challenges that we still have. We have seen some of the anniversaries and celebrations of the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act in this country, but we've also seen the challenges and the things that we still have to do in this country, across the country, whether in Baltimore, in Ferguson, or in New York City. As the President highlighted at the Summit of the Americas in Panama, we continue to speak out on these issues not because we are interested in meddling, but because we know from our own history that we must stand up for what is right. And it is precisely because we are imperfect that we know it is necessary. We participated in an Inter-American Commission on Human Rights hearing entitled Criminal Justice and Race in the United States in March to highlight domestic efforts to combat discrimination and share lessons learned from our engagement with other countries. And please note that I said share, not lecture. But we know that we don't have all the answers, and we value these exchanges with hemispheric partners to find solutions to problems that are common to all of us. So we've created with Brazil and Colombia formal dialogues and coordination on people-to-people and educational exchanges, English language programs, youth leadership development, and creating economic opportunities to advance our dialogues. In Colombia, the entire U.S. mission has made concerns of the Afro-Colombian population a significant priority. In Brazil, we look forward to a second health seminar under the U.S.-Brazil Joint Action Plan to eliminate racial and ethnic discrimination and promote equality, to address health disparities and figure out how we can ensure that all our citizens have equal access to quality health care. Last year, we began a similar process with Uruguay on signing an MOU on racial and ethnic equality and social inclusion. And since 2008, we've brought together communities on the Dominican Republic-Haiti border for exchange programs including journalists, editor exchanges, cultural exhibits, youth camps, and teacher training to promote mutual understanding, something I think you will agree is needed now more than ever, perhaps. Under the Americas Partnership for Social Inclusion and Equality, we're funding projects to build the capacity of vulnerable groups in Brazil, in Colombia, Ecuador, Paraguay, and Peru. Our College Horizons outreach programs in the region are improving educational opportunities for students from indigenous and African descent communities. And I have to tell you, the College Horizons program is one of the most remarkable things. When I go and visit countries and have the opportunity to meet with those students, it is really something that gives me great hope for the future of this hemisphere. In particular, I would note that once recently when I was in Paraguay, I had the opportunity to hear some of those students debate Columbus, villain or hero? We didn't come to a conclusion. Many are the first in their families to attend university and have become examples of community service, leadership, and academic excellence. They credit the program with providing them these opportunities. And I want to tell you the story of just one of them because it's quite remarkable. Tito Chileama is an architect and community leader who teaches the indigenous Nahua Pipil language to children in Western El Salvador. Tito Chileama is also the first Salvadoran Pipil recipient of a Hubert H. Humphrey Fellowship, which includes 20 weeks of pre-academic intensive English training at Virginia Tech and an academic year at MIT. Tito wants to use urban design as a way to build a culture of peace and reconciliation and to create more jobs and opportunities for youth by enhancing the tourist industry. And I'm especially proud to say that we are expanding the international education opportunities through the 100,000 Strong in the Americas program for a more diverse group of students, including historically marginalized populations, to have the opportunity to gain global skills and experience throughout the region and study abroad. If 100,000 Strong in the Americas helps only those students who have always studied outside their country and whose parents or grandparents studied outside the country, we will have failed. So it is our goal to ensure that students like Tito Chileama are able to access that program. The United States is also finally beginning to seriously address discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. To help spread that momentum beyond our borders, my Bureau has developed the department's first regional strategy for eliminating violence and discrimination against LGBTI persons. Our missions around the region host pride events with LGBTI activists and relevant stakeholders and facilitate exchange with US-based experts. We recognize that we have had many partners in this endeavor, with Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Uruguay, and Argentina working hand in glove at the UN on discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, and we are grateful for those partnerships. And it has not always been easy in many parts of this region. Recently, our International Law Enforcement Academy in San Salvador partnered with the Atlanta Police Department to train police, prosecutors, and judges from the region on hate crimes, including those based on sexual orientation, gender identity, gender, race, ethnicity, or religion. And that course generated so much local interest that Salvadoran participants agreed to stand up a working group to promote hate crimes legislation in that country. Now, that's not necessarily the typical results you see out of our law enforcement programs. But no economy can thrive when women are not given a seat at the table. Unfortunately, ingrained sociocultural attitudes about women and girls, high levels of violence and impunity, inadequate legal frameworks, and weak institutions continue to hold them back. Lesbian, transgender, indigenous, and African descent women and girls, and those with disabilities, often confront multiple forms of discrimination. We've expanded our most important political dialogues to prevent and respond to gender-based violence, promote women and girls in science and technology, and break down the economic barriers that women face in the region. Through the Central America Regional Security Initiative, we support the 24-hour court system in Guatemala, which is an effective means of reducing pretrial detention, protecting victims, and increasing the efficiency of the judicial system. We know that one of the smartest investments we can make is empowering women entrepreneurs, helping them to achieve economic independence, which can also help them to achieve independence from violence. That's why President Obama launched the Women's Entrepreneurship in the Americas initiative, to give women and girls equal access to the training, tools, opportunities, and resources that they need to become entrepreneurs, business owners, and future leaders. Over 20,000 women in more than 20 countries are expected to benefit from the over 40 partnerships we have built through We Americas by the end of 2015. And yes, that includes participants from Cuba. We have MOUs with Brazil on the advancement of women, with Mexico on promoting gender equality, and with Chile, Colombia, Mexico, Peru, and Uruguay on economic empowerment of women entrepreneurs. When women entrepreneurs succeed, they drive economic growth and invest more in both their families and their communities. I hope that this gives you some sense of how we're trying to address social and economic inclusion and how America's Quarterly Social Inclusion Index really helps us in the development of our own policy and programming. We use it as an essential tool as we move forward in designing new programs and adjusting our programs. I look forward very much to the discussion of the experts here today, some of whom I've had the opportunity to meet, so that we can explore ways to advance social and economic inclusion in the Americas, which continues to be one of the most important items on our agenda. Thank you so much for your attention. Good timing, huh? You don't get to drink that coffee, Susan. I apologize. I could have run a little longer, but I think everyone's waiting for you.
No, I'm going to have to read your speech now. We're seeing it on webcast.
There you go. It's all captured.
Hi. Hello. How are you?
Welcome.
Thank you. First of all, I want to apologize. I have the worst luck on shuttles coming from New York to Washington, D.C. I actually left my house at 6 o'clock in the morning, and as the pilot said, This is the second time in 30 years that they had to take the plane back to the gate because the luggage wasn't properly balanced on the plane and they weren't allowed to take off. So between that and the rain, it was not a great morning. But I'm thrilled to be here. I'm sorry I missed Roberta's presentation, but one of the great things about webcasting is I can go back and look at it at leisure, and I do that with almost everything we do in any event. So good morning. Again, I apologize. We are so pleased to welcome everyone to the launch of the 2015 America's Quarterly Social Inclusion Index. I'd like to give a very special welcome to my good friend, Roberta Jacobson. Thank you so much for joining us. She's the Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs, as everybody knows. And I want to welcome also our panelists, Judith Morrison, Senior Advisor for Gender and Diversity Division at the IDB, Carlos Quesada, Executive Director at the International Institute on Race, Equality, and Human Rights, Mauricio Vivero, CEO of the Seattle International Foundation, Elizabeth Zeckermeister of Latin American Public Opinion at Vanderbilt University, and our moderator, Alana Tumino, Senior Editor of America's Quarterly and Director of Policy at America's Society and Council of the Americas, and she's just great. She's been the driver of the team that really put together the Social Inclusion Index, and she's done so much in providing leadership to the whole team. I want to thank the State Department and particularly the Race, Ethnicity, and Social Inclusion Unit for their partnership in today's event. We will have the opportunity to hear more about their important work, or you actually have heard more about their important work from Roberta. And of course, a big thanks to Mauricio Vivero and the Seattle International Foundation for their ongoing support of the index and their dedication to encouraging greater inclusion and poverty alleviation throughout the globe. And I want to thank HSBC as well, a crucial supporter of America's Quarterly for 2015. Finally, I want to welcome everyone who's joining us from around the world via webcast, and I want to thank our global webcast sponsor, Telefonica. So we are so pleased to be presenting our fourth Social Inclusion Index. As we have discussed often, it is not a perfect index, but it does expand the discussion, and it gets better every year that we do it, and it will get better, even better next year. But it measures the key variables for inclusion, and it particularly measures progress and relationships between different countries, including the United States. And as we have learned, that it is not only growth which is important, but it is socially inclusive growth which drives the lives of citizens. The discussion of social inclusion is not a new topic, but what is new is the number of leaders targeting social inclusion as a critical part of their platforms. Our index considers growth to be a key driver, because without growth and prosperity, there is little opportunity for upward mobility and social inclusion. Our index, however, then goes on to show that there are other critical elements to level the playing field. Some of the key variables are access to formal jobs, education, and quality of education. Frankly, my view is quality of education is as important as education itself, and equal rights, irrespective of race, gender, ethnicity, or sexual orientation. But of equal importance, it is clear that governments and thus proactive legislation can and must be important drivers of some of the key variables which encourage inclusion and the building of institutions which will, over the long term, support a truly inclusive society. And as we see in Latin America and the United States, it is not only good development policy, but it is also good politics, as everyone is talking about social inclusion. Everyone, and this is something which is universal, wants something better for their family and their children. So today we're here to talk about inclusive policies and what that really means. But we are also here to celebrate those who have done it best And in fact, for the second year in a row, Uruguay is at the top of our index. So, a round of applause and congratulations to Uruguay. But more importantly, I think what's really cool and what I love is the competition. So we try to get countries to compete and think that this is important. With that, I'd like to pass it over to Alana, who will chair our panel. Again, thank you all, and I apologize for being late.
Well, thank you to Susan for your leadership on this issue as an organization, and also for the support of the America's Quarterly Social Inclusion Index. Thank you for Roberta's remarks. It's great to be partnering with the State Department, as I mentioned, for this launch event. We have a great panel with us today. As Susan mentioned, they're just going to get mic'd up while I give a few remarks about the index, and then we're going to turn it into a great panel discussion among all participants. So as we mentioned, this is the 4th year of America's Quarterly Social Inclusion Index, and we're ranking 17 countries across 22 variables throughout the region. Each year, the index grows slightly, or we update it and modify it. As we mentioned, we added a new ethno-racial inclusion variable this year, but we also try to stay pretty consistent from year to year in terms of the countries we rank and the indicators we use, so we can actually have an annual year-over-year comparison of the different countries in the region. As we mentioned, Uruguay came out on top. This was followed by the United States and then Argentina. And then at the bottom of the pack, what we've been seeing pretty consistently since we started the index is some countries in Central America's Northern Triangle region, specifically Guatemala and Honduras, are at the bottom of the ranking. We're viewing social inclusion broadly. It's more than just poverty reduction. It's looking at issues of personal empowerment, of financial inclusion, women's rights, LGBT rights, access to jobs and housing. In the inserts that you all have, that we have in both Spanish and English, you can see the full set of indicators that we look at. And to be equally exhaustive, we also look at and work with a variety of experts and get our sources from a variety of different organizations that are working on this, so we can have a comprehensive view of what social inclusion looks like in the region. Again, you can look at the inserts to see each one of these separately, but it's working with some of our experts here on our panel, like Judith Morrison and Liz Zeichmeister. It's also working to gather data from the World Bank's socioeconomic database for Latin America and Caribbean, or household survey data information that's housed at the World Bank, disaggregated by race and gender, looking at the percent of GDP spent on education and healthcare, looking at political rights and civil rights, and we draw this from a variety of sources. And so the result is we're able to see how each country fares against each other. We have all of our rankings by variable in the insert, so you can see how countries rank on women's rights, on LGBT, on civil rights, political rights, and then we can see how countries compare to one another. And there were some encouraging signs and some deeper challenges within this. Overall, we saw that there were large gains in access to adequate housing and gains in poverty reduction. Every country has actually improved in the percentage of the population living on more than $4 a day, except for Honduras, that declined in this category. We saw gains in financial inclusion, in perceptions of government responsiveness and personal empowerment. But a closer look reveals that there are still challenges, and the Assistant Secretary alluded to this in her remarks as well, that we still see that women and Indigenous and African descendant populations still remain to be marginalized communities, and that they lag in many of these indicators when compared to the general population. So there's still challenges ahead, even though we're seeing growth in the areas of social inclusion. This is especially important as Latin America experiences slower economic growth. It's really important that we're able to monitor and expand the social gains that all of these countries have made in the past decades. And so I'm really looking forward to today's discussion to hear from our experts talk more deeply about these issues. A few housekeeping items before we begin. In honor of our social inclusion launch and also the beginning of the International Decade for People of African Descent, we will be live tweeting with the hashtag social inclusion, hashtag African Descent, as well as our Twitter handles at AMER Quarterly and at ASCOA. I also want to thank, as I already thanked Zakia's team at the State Department for partnering with us today, and just a few shout outs on my team. I want to give a big thanks to Becky Bintram for your tireless work and effort in putting together all the details of this index. It's a tough task to put together each year, so thanks for your enthusiasm. I also want to thank my colleague Leonie Garcia for your leadership in putting together the Innovators Profile section that we have on African descendant leaders that you can also see in the inserts today. I really encourage you to read the different profiles of the leaders in this section. And I also want to thank Adriana Roberta, who helped us really analyze the results this year and help compile the results. So thanks to my team as well. So the plan now, I'm gonna go sit on the panel and get mic'd up so we can have a good discussion, and then we will. I know we're running a little bit late given our timing, but we'll try to have a conversation among our panelists and still leave time for question and answers. So start formulating some questions that you might have. The first question I'd like to address is to Mauricio Vivero. The Seattle International Foundation has supported our Social Inclusion Index for years now, but you also do and work on different global programs to reduce poverty with a special emphasis in Central America. So I just want to ask you, why support the AQ Social Index? Why is this important? What impact do you think this has throughout the hemisphere?
Thanks. It's nice to be here with you and celebrate this great launch. We, as a small foundation, try to really invest in things that have maximum impact, given that we're our size and our limited resources. And good research can be a fantastic driver for social change. So we feel strongly that's an important tool. And I'll give you some kind of the reasoning behind it. Number one, it puts a spotlight on the facts. The facts matter. Central America in particular does not get the attention that it deserves from U.S. philanthropy, in our opinion. And so by highlighting the problems of the region, the specific challenges, such as crime or the number of girls that have access to formal education, we're putting a spotlight on those issues, and we're also putting a spotlight on the region, which we think is very important. Secondly, this is an important tool for those advocates in those countries who are trying to get their governments to do the right thing. It's a way to really have specific information from a credible source that is a tool for them. It's a tool in the media, it's a tool as they lobby, it's a tool as they mobilize citizens around causes. We've seen an amazing resurgence of citizen action in Guatemala around corruption issues. So those, as an independent tool, it can really drive that. And then the third thing I would say that's important to us is that by doing this every year, we see some trends. You know, where is our investment making a difference? As a country, as a philanthropic community, where are the trends going? Are we making progress? And so having these numbers really can help us assess and continue to focus on those problem areas, right? Like you mentioned Honduras,
Right.
in terms of the reduction of people who live above poverty. Those are important statistics. So for all those reasons, we feel it's a really good research is an important driver to the change that we want to see happen.
And I guess to follow along with that, you know, as you alluded to this, it really helps you put numbers to what you're seeing in the region, and you've done a lot of work in Central America over the years. So, what are you seeing? You know, progress in the region? What specific setbacks have you seen throughout the work that you've done over the years there, and where do you see it going in the near future?
Well, you know, it's a very complicated, especially the Northern Triangle, very complicated region of the world. I think we certainly see very depressing statistics in terms of violence, poverty, weak institutions. But at the same time, in our areas of focus, public policy and leadership, we do see important changes. We see, with the right support, institutions can work. Look at CICIG in Guatemala. We also see a whole new class of leaders in the business sector, in religious institutions, in women's groups, in indigenous groups who are mobilizing, pushing their governments, affecting policy, and that really gives us a lot of hope. So it's a mixed bag. The overall statistics continue, I think, to be very depressing, but we see signs of hope in terms of specific policy changes. You know, the 24-hour courts in Guatemala, for example, you know, that came out of pressure from the outside, pressure from the inside, citizen action. good policy analysis. So if we see all those things together, we can make change. And so we're hopeful that there'll continue to be progress in terms of public policy, and we all can continue to support those leaders and institutions doing the real hard work of driving those societies forward.
That's great. Yeah, last year or the year before when we published the index and countries like Guatemala scored very low, we did see that there was a large response from the region, that countries want to do better, that, a group of private sector business leaders who work with various communities throughout the state actually wrote a response to America's Quarterly and said, hey, we're working on addressing all of these different areas where Guatemala ranked very low. We want to be proactive in really creating a situation on the ground that can work to address it. So hopefully we will see some progress in the future in that area of Central America. Thanks, Mauricio. Judith, you've worked with us for years on, or you've worked in years in your career on the issue of inclusion throughout Latin America and collecting statistics. This year, as I mentioned, we created a new ethno-racial variable with your help and your team at the IDB. So thank you for your collaboration. The question for you is, getting to talk about really collecting data and statistics. What are the biggest challenges you see in the region on collecting data and collecting these statistics? And do you think that there are some countries who do this better than others, and why that is?
Well, first of all, I want to thank the Council of the Americas, America's Society, and America's Quarterly for taking this so seriously for so many years. I remember about 5, maybe even almost 6 years ago, having a conversation with Chris Sabatini and sitting around a table in New York discussing some of the challenges around this exercise. I think it was a very analytically rigorous conversation. It was a conversation that I think many institutions would have walked away from. And I think the fact that you've hung in there and that you've continued to improve the index and really have taken it very seriously, both in terms of promoting it, letting people know about it, is just a real benefit to all. One of the nice things about the positioning of the institution also means that you're in the business of doing rankings. And these rankings, even though we know that the measurements are not always perfect, the rankings give us a starting place and also a place to start a conversation, so that countries now are taking this seriously. They want to have more visibility. They want to improve. They want to do better. I think one of the biggest challenges that we face in the region around specifically data for race and ethnicity is the lack of information. We know that most census data does now incorporate race and ethnicity, but several of the household surveys don't. I think the next frontier is really administrative data. So we're talking about data on education, on healthcare, data that governments themselves collect. I think sometimes it's considered not necessarily politically correct to ask the question about someone's race or ethnicity. And for that reason, it's very important for us that we need this information to understand gaps. And we know that development is really about understanding gaps. I think the opening remarks by Roberta Jacobson talked quite a bit about development doesn't happen if we don't include these populations. And in Latin America, we're talking about populations that are not minority groups. In many cases, these are populations that are the majority, and certainly the majority of the poor. In terms of countries that are doing well, we know that certain countries have collected data for decades. We know that other countries are just beginning to ask the question. I think there are ways that we can provide support. I think there are ways that we can encourage countries to have the courage to ask the question and to not be afraid of receiving the results.
And do you think, in looking at that issue of data and collection and what countries are doing or not, in terms of actual specific policy measures, what measures do you think could be taken in these countries to improve the quality of the data that they're collecting?
Well, I think part of it is making it standard practice to ask the question. I think one of the other things that we're seeing, and one of the challenges with the index and looking at the new ethno-racial variable, we're looking at laws and we're looking at codifying how many laws do countries have on the books. We know that having laws on the books in and of itself is not enough. It's about enforcement, it's about budget, it's about administrative lines of responsibility. These are all far more subjective. But I think it's giving us a little bit of the bunching in the index where kind of the usual suspects are floating to the top, but there may be other countries that are emerging. And I think one of the ways of deciding this is to really have rigorous conversations, perhaps even including a little bit more of a qualitative analysis from legal experts and people who follow some of these trends in the field, so that we can glean out the nuances of what does it mean to have a strong legal framework. for protections for ethno-racial minority groups or ethno-racially vulnerable groups. I think the other question, though, again, when we think about the cost of surveys, surveys can be very expensive. And if we look at the statistics institutes, many of them have faced some pretty significant funding challenges over the years. What does that mean in real terms? It means maybe they're asking fewer questions, maybe they're cutting the size of the survey, maybe they're not getting out to rural or remote communities to ask the question. There are all sorts of ways that we can tweak and make adjustments. Sometimes those adjustments may be oversampling. And Liz and I were talking actually a few minutes ago about some of the benefits of oversampling certain types of populations. It's important too that we not make generalizations. We know particularly in the case of indigenous peoples, what you'll find is a number of the countries will have the survey perhaps in one or two languages, but not in all indigenous languages. So you have very strong kind of overrepresentation of certain racial or ethnic groups. I think the other thing, and I want to praise the statistics institutes in the region, is that many of them have engaged in a dialogue. And a dialogue with constituents, knowing full well that this is very important for them to be able to access information. Sometimes one of the other challenges we're facing is that certain regions may be more violent. When we're thinking about Central America or certainly rural or urban communities or remote rural communities in the Andes, sometimes you may not be able to access unless you have a good dialogue with communities. And I think the statistics institutes have really advanced and have really progressed in those areas. So I'm very, very optimistic about what's happening in the region. And again, I think we're looking at a situation where we're poised to have better data in the future. And that's key to this exercise, and that's key to development as a whole. You can't talk about development without having good base indicators. You can't design programs. You don't know what success looks like if you don't know where you're starting from.
I just want to give a thanks to Roberta Jacobson for coming with us. I know you have to run to your next meeting, so thank you very much for... No. Thank you. No, Judith, and I'm glad to hear that you're optimistic. I think a lot of the work that we focused on is really how to make, how to have a dialogue so we can actually be including these communities and really starting to advance this. I think, if you were to talk about this 20 years ago, we've come a long way, and I think we're only heading into the right direction here, which, is a nice segue. Carlos, I wanted to ask you, based on your expertise and your background, and maybe Judith touched on this a little bit as well, but share with us, what is the importance of the census in Latin America? We collect a lot of household data survey here for the index that is based on different censuses throughout Latin America, as I mentioned, and housed at the World Bank. But give us a little more insights on why this is important and how, for example, the African descendant population is participating in this process.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I think, having accurate data collection on populations is very important because it's going to give the government's tools to identify populations in need and how to allocate resources. I think that's kind of the main purpose of the census. Unfortunately, in Latin America, the census has been only used to count populations rather than allocate resources. And this has been, one, because of the structural racism that still exists in Latin America. I mean, we still have countries like Cuba, for instance, where there's a complete denial of the existence of racial discrimination, or you have countries like Brazil and Colombia that have collecting data on racial discrimination, but sometimes they say, well, we don't have enough resources to allocate, to reach out to everybody. I think it's very important. I think that the fact that I would like to emphasize that the census or data itself is not enough. I mean, you have to use data, and the government needs to use data, as I said before, to allocate resources. And this is the kind of the challenge we have in Latin America. So that's why, for instance, a lot of people, especially Afro-descendants and indigenous, they feel that it is not important to count. Why should I say that I'm an Afro-descendant if my life is not going to change, structurally speaking? So what we're doing actually is trying to strengthen the capacity of our partners so they can actually be part of the census process. And I think that's very important. Not only to ask the question, but also how do you ask the question? Like, for instance, in Costa Rica, they had 2 questions, and the population was, like, the Afro-Costa Rican population was 1.9, and then in 2010, when they added another question on race, the population jumped to 7%. And that's because the Afro-Costa Rican community was consulted in the process. So the importance, what I would like to emphasize here is the importance of these populations to participate in design, implementation, and analysis of the data after the census. And not only the census, but household surveys and other kind of gathering information techniques. And finally, there is like a lot of disparity in the region. Like Peru, for instance, has not collected data since 1940. So we're gonna, finally in 2017, we're gonna start collecting data on the situation or on how many Afro-Peruvians are. So anyway, so yeah, it's very important, but we have a lot of challenges, and Afro-Latino population is being key, so to speak, in order to change how the census are being conducted lately.
And so you mentioned Peru in 2017 is going to go, finally including some of these questions on their census. And in other work that we've done in the region, we've talked to various people in Peru who have really been working on this 2017 census and putting together these questions. And it seems like it is a very intense process. Lots of different actors and stakeholders are part of this. And you really have to dedicate time in order to make these kinds of differences. Is that going to hold back some countries from including it? Or are you seeing, is Peru the leader here? Or are there other countries also doing this kind of work?
Yeah, well, we have to understand that the census, when you're talking about census, you're talking about politics, because they have an impact. So it depends on the government, it depends on resources, budget, et cetera. And some countries actually don't want to conduct censuses because they don't want to reallocate resources or discuss resources they have. In the case of Peru, I would like, because I've been following the process very well, we're working right now with the Afro-Peruvian community. We have to admit that the current Peruvian government has been very open to include the variable in the next census. So the population has been consulted widely on what kind of questions are we going to ask, which is very, very important. Now what we're working with the government, unfortunately, the census is going to happen with a different government. So what we're working right now is like try to secure the funding for 2017, and also trying to empower the Afro-Peruvian community on what to do with once the data is available, and how they can actually use this. And this is the other thing I wanted to say, like not only in Peru but in other places, how they can use this as an advocacy tool, because actually they're like there's going to be data on socioeconomic indicators, which is very, very important for Afro-descendant communities. And regarding the kind of the second part of the question, Colombia is going to have the census in 2016. Okay. They were supposed to have it this year precisely because of funding. They moved it to 2016. And Chile, as probably you already know, it was like one of the worst censuses ever that was conducted like a couple of years ago. They have to conduct the census again, and they were planning to include the Afro-Chilean population, which is great. Yeah.
That's great. And switching gears slightly, because I know you're also an expert on issues of gender and gender identity and LGBT rights. Why do you think it's important to start collecting data based on sexual orientation right now throughout Latin America?
Well, we still are in diapers in Latin America, unfortunately. I mean, the data is being collected on a lot of issues by civil society organizations. Like I would like to, to say, like for instance, in terms of violence, they're not the governments who are the ones actually conducting or collecting data, but civil society organizations. Like in Brazil, there is an NGO that is collecting data on homicides. In Peru, there are organizations actually conducting data on equal or marriage equality. Or in Colombia, there are organizations conducting data on laws and how these laws have been affecting these populations. And then, like you have, there is like a huge problem here with discrimination in the labor market for LGBT communities. Like if you're gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual, et cetera, and you're open in your workplace, you actually can face a lot of discrimination, or you can lose your job. So there's we are in diapers, and unfortunately, I'm glad that you actually mentioned this, because I think what we're seeing, what the positive steps we're seeing in Latin America, with the exception maybe of Argentina and Uruguay, is being because of there is a little bit of pressure from the U.S. So countries like in the English-speaking Caribbean, where the situation is horrible and terrible, the few positive steps have been taken because of the pressure from the U.S.
That's great. Well, that's great, and I hope that this index as well can shed some light in that area as well. So, Liz, I want to ask you some questions. We've had a great partnership with you and your colleagues at LaPop at Vanderbilt University to really talk about public opinion in the region, which I think is a very important but also very hard thing to quantify. And you guys have been working for years in this. So my first question for you is, tell us a little bit about how the data from LaPop on personal empowerment, government responsiveness, and civil society participation, how is that included, and how do you do that throughout the region?
Okay, thanks. Well, I just want to join the panelists in saying thank you so much for having us here, and Susan for having this event, and the sponsors, the State Department, and others. It's been a real source of pride for LaPop, which is a research institute hosted by Vanderbilt University, to be part of the Social Inclusion Index since the very first conversations around tables in New York and by phone. With Chris Sabatini and the team sort of pounding out this idea of looking systematically and comprehensively at this topic of social inclusion and engaging in an extensive set of dialogues around it, and we're just really pleased to be part of it again. So thank you so much. The data that LaPop contributes to the Social Inclusion Index come from nationally representative surveys that we carry out throughout the Americas as part of our Americas Barometer Regional Survey Project. And so these are nationally representative surveys. They're conducted face-to-face in people's households. Nationally representative means that we go to rural areas as well as urban areas. We interview people who are rich, people who are poor, people of all different skin tones and ethnic and racial identifications. We do everything that we can to achieve a nationally representative sample. And that allows us to then speak on these issues in a way that gives us confidence that we are representing the nation as a whole. But in addition, we can segment the data and look at different subgroups within that overall sample. The data that we collect are based on sample designs and questionnaire designs that are meticulously crafted with our input and with input of partners across the region, and through a process of qualitative iterative pre-testing. So to follow on some comments that were just made, it's important to talk to people before you interview them about the ways in which they refer to themselves, the ways that they understand issues of the day, and make sure that the wording is as precise as possible and fits the local lexicon, so that the data that we gain from this field work is quality data. The survey data is collected in a series of interviews that are conducted by local teams, with LaPop providing input with respect to design, but also coordination and, very importantly, quality control from our base at Vanderbilt University. So I think that answers your question as to how the data come about.
Yeah, I think, and going further, why, these issues like personal empowerment and government responsiveness, I guess the question is, why is this important when you think about inclusion? And then looking at that data and the results that we have in the index, what are some of the surprises that you see from that? Maybe some contradictions in the data that you took away from it when you collect this from the region?
Thanks. So 2 of the 3 indicators that we contribute are attitudinal indicators. They're about people's perceptions of, as you said, of their own personal empowerment or of government responsiveness. And to me, maybe not surprisingly, this is one of the neat aspects of the index. And I think you can think of it this way: when you go into the doctor's office for your annual exam, the doctor doesn't just take your temperature, doesn't just take your vitals and tell you if you're healthy, right? The doctor asks you, how do you feel? And that's an important part of the diagnostics or toolkit that the doctor is bringing to bear on this assessment. And so likewise, when we look at social inclusion, I think it's important that we ask people the extent to which they feel empowered and the extent to which they feel a sense of belongingness and that the government is responsive to them. Because social inclusion without that, I think is a limited social inclusion. So I think that that's the first, an answer to the first part of your question. And the second part of your question about surprises, I'll mention a couple, but let me also note that the data from the Americas Barometer are freely available. You can download the data sets. You take a look at them yourselves. We ask all sorts of questions. We ask questions about attitudes towards individuals who identify as gay. We ask questions about people's experiences with and perceptions of discrimination across a host of issue areas. We ask about well-being, and a number of other variables are in those data sets that are pertinent to these discussions. So again, the data are available for free. It's a shameless plug, but it's a plug made in the interest of getting people to take a look at these data at a finer to a finer degree that I'm going to be able to right now. So let me just say a couple of things about what I see in these data that we include in the Social Inclusion Index. One thing that's really interesting to me is when we look at personal empowerment and government responsiveness across the region, across every country, the mean level of personal empowerment that we see is higher than the mean level of perceived government responsiveness, right? So this means that people feel more capable of being included than they see the government as including them, right? So that suggests some weaknesses to the government's efforts across the region with respect to including populations, but it also suggests opportunity. So efforts by governments to engage citizens are going to meet with a motivated and confident citizenry that is ready to take part in policy making and implementation and all sorts of issues and programs related to social inclusion. So that's one thing. Another thing that we see is when we look at gender gaps, we see that there are not too many gender gaps when we look at perceptions of government responsiveness, and that's interesting, I think. Although we see some, but not very substantial gender gaps on that dimension. When we look, though, at personal empowerment, again, across every country in the region, we see that women feel less empowered than men. And so I think that highlights probably an intuition that we all have and provides the data to back it up, that work needs to be done to make bridges to female populations to promote their inclusion in politics. And I think the last thing I'll note that's somewhat surprising or at least interesting and we're thinking about is that when we look at perceptions of government responsiveness across the region, we don't see that it's always the case that the wealthier countries are those where people feel that the government is more responsive. And I think probably the US stands as an interesting case in that regard. If you look at our data, perceptions of personal empowerment are very high in the US, but perceptions of government responsiveness are not so high. And Argentina is another example there. But we can look at other countries like Bolivia and Nicaragua, which deal with sort of a more limited portfolio, more limited economic portfolio, and yet are countries where we find higher levels of perceptions of government responsiveness. So, it's important to invest in programs and policies that are, and put sort of, money where our mouth is with respect to promoting social inclusion, but that only gets us so far. There needs to be a significant, concerted, and demonstrated effort by governments to convince citizens that it's worthwhile to travel across these bridges that governments might extend out to the different populations that exist within their country.
Thanks so much, Liz. And I think that brings up another large point too, is kind of next steps. What is it, the impact of this index and what kind of different policy measures can be taken in the region and what we can do to help promote those policies across the board, whether we're talking about violence in Central America or issues of adding data into censuses or feelings of government responsiveness, getting governments to respond. Like I mentioned, like we've had in Guatemala, like we've had great responses from, countries that have done well, from Uruguay, for example, and others. So continuing to push the envelope on that that level as well. What I want to do is I really, in the past when we've done these presentations, we always have such a rich conversation with the people in the room in terms of your questions and looking at some of these issues, dive a little bit more deeply into some of the issues that are of interest to you. We can take advantage of having some great experts with us. I think in a very, everyone has their own different areas of expertise, so all together we might be able to more fully and better answer some people's questions from the audience. So we have some mics, and I will open it up to questions right now for this. Thanks, Becky. Yes, please. If you just mind identifying yourself, we'll get you a mic in just a second. Identifying yourself, and thanks so much.
I'm June Beidel with the Congressional Research Service. I have a question about South America. Ecuador is fairly highly ranked. I want to understand better the relationship in social inclusion with like freedom of expression, or political involvement. So could someone address Ecuador?
Sure. So, what we saw overall, and I'm just going to refer to my notes because I don't actually have this off the top of my head for all of them. But in terms of Ecuador, what we're seeing is that Ecuador did very well in terms of government responsiveness by gender. They scored very high on civil society participation by both gender and race, government responsiveness by race and gender, secondary school. So they did do very well in a number of these categories, but they still had low formal employment by gender. And they also had less access to adequate housing by race. So we saw that Ecuador is actually doing well across a number of the indicators that we saw, but there are still some challenges. And that's my perception. I don't know if you guys working more closely on these, on Ecuador or on anything, have anything to add to that. Thanks, Jen. Sure, there, and then we'll go here after.
Okay.
Hi, good morning. First of all, I wanted to congratulate all the panelists. It's a really interesting discussion, and to all those who've been involved in promoting the Social Inclusion Index. I am Anna Coates. I'm the Chief of Gender and Cultural Diversity at the Pan American Health Organization. I think Judith mentioned the challenges that we have with data. Data has been mentioned by all the panelists, is extremely important. Those challenges, I think, are even more when we're talking about the administrative data. And in the health sector, we see that very much, particularly in terms of race and ethnicity, and also in terms of gender identity, as Carlos mentioned. It'd be good at some point if we could see ourselves at a point where access to health were to be included in the Social Inclusion Index. I think that's one of the key indicators, obviously, of development and of equality. We have, the governments of the region have agreed the universal strategy on access to health and universal coverage. It's also within the Sustainable Development Goals, so it would be a key way of being able to promote accountability and measure progress in that area. Just to say that we will, in the Pan American Health Organization, we're working very much on this area. It's one of our key areas of work within gender and cultural diversity. We will have a couple of meetings towards this end of the year that I just wanted to highlight because it may be of interest to people. We're having a regional meeting on Afro-descendant health, which we will hold in Colombia in October, and one here in DC at the beginning of December, which will be on the broader issue of ethnicity and health. One thing that we will be touching on within that is data, and one of the key things that we'll be looking at is actually some of the differences in the concepts that go behind the indicators. So we talk here about ethnicity and race, and I think sometimes we slightly conflate those, but those differences in the concepts and how they're managed between the different countries can make a difference in terms of the comparability of the data that we're using. So it'd be interesting to hear also the panelists' comments on that.
Thanks so much. I think in first response, and then maybe I'll pass it over to Judith if you have some response to that as well. In terms of looking at health, and thanks to all the work you do with the Pan American Health Organization, what we're going to be doing next year is, now that we're entering kind of our 5th year anniversary of the Social Inclusion Index, is really taking a deeper look into what exactly we're measuring, how we might want to change this moving forward, how we're really looking at the different indicators. Because like I said, there's always this push and pull. We want to continue to update the index. We want to continue to add new indicators indicators and really look at countries across these different issues, and access to health is actually a really interesting data point that we can look at. But we also have the pull from the other side saying, hey, we want to have a consistent index year over year. And so really trying to, come to terms with those two, with that aspect. And what we've been seeing from year to year is that we have slightly modified the index each year. When we started this 4 years ago, I think we were at 12 countries. When Seattle International Foundation joined us, we added more Central American countries. So little by little, we've been adding to the index, not only from a country perspective, but also from the variable perspective and different indices. And so maybe, I'm not exactly sure what our 5th year anniversary will bring, but it might be kind of a deeper look on what exactly it is that we're looking at. In terms of the ethnicity and race, I don't know, Judith, if you want to talk about that a little bit.
I mean, this is a huge issue when you're doing harmonization across multiple data sets. And one of the things actually that we recently completed at the Inter-American Development Bank, and we hope we can make it public relatively quickly, is an exercise in terms of how to harmonize. Because certain racial or ethnic groups are defined in different ways in their countries. And some of it is a constitutional definition, so it's very politically sensitive. But the challenge is when you're working at an international organization and you have to make generalizations across the region, you kind of have to know more or less what the categories are. And one of the things I think we started out many years ago having a conversation around race and ethnicity. It's so challenging, people don't want to deal with the issue. And I think one of the biggest issues is that it's difficult for pure quantitative researchers or econometricians to be placed in a position where they have to make a decision about who's what race or ethnicity. And we're hoping that this tool will help other researchers, because in my experience I found that many people understand that race and ethnicity is an important variable for understanding exclusion in the region, but they don't want to have to make that decision. And what we've decided to do is we're looking at both Afro-identity, Indigenous identity, Afro-Indigenous identity, and really teasing out what are the others. And when you're doing, looking at large data sets and large data sets over time, the question changes. So the actual act of looking at how has the question evolved over the last 20 years in the different countries will also determine your outcomes. So we have a very complete set of different kinds of static commands and different ways that you can program going back to the original features or the forms to help facilitate this. And I'm hoping that by making this information a little bit more public, what will happen is researchers will now know that there's at least a methodology that's out there that they can begin to use. It may not be the definitive methodology, we may need to still do some tweaking, but it means that you're taking it to a level where people who do economic and data and statistical analysis feel a level of confidence reaching into this area that's a little bit more nebulous. Now, what's surprising is that when we look at these kinds of overlaps of race and ethnicity, we're often not talking about populations that are very large in countries, but it's a very, very politically sensitive issue. And I think that's precisely why we want to be so sensitive about how we deal with these questions. And I think for us, this use of an Afro-Indigenous category is very helpful for certain types of populations, and we can talk about those later, and I know that there are representatives from some of those populations actually here in the room, but when we're talking about teasing out who's Garifuna or who's Miskito, or if Garifunas are defined as indigenous in some communities and African descendant in others, what does that mean? The other thing I wanted to mention very briefly on health data. Health data is interesting and curious because people are so concerned about discrimination in terms of the quality of access of health care that you will see a lot more resistance for people to self-identify. They feel that they may be put at the end of the line or that they may get a different kind of treatment from their doctor. And I think this is particularly true in a Latin American context. We have to be very sensitive about that. I would recommend sampling. I think some of the opinion surveys are very, very important in the short term to get access to information about access to quality of health care. I also would advocate very strongly in the case of healthcare to make the question about race and ethnicity very separate from the atendimiento, from the moment that you're actually receiving the services. Because again, we found that people are much, much less likely to provide that information. In certain cases too, when there are surveys that are done by employers, you'll find that racial and ethnic identity may go down, in part because people may perceive that self-identification with a certain racial or ethnic group group may make them look at like they're particularly activist within their workplace, or may limit their professional opportunities. So again, I think that there are ways that you can look at anonymous surveys. One of the things that we did internally at the Inter-American Development Bank is we did a large-scale survey that's more or less representative of staff as a whole, but was completely separate, for example, from your employment record, as it were, to get really good information. And we actually found out that a lot more people were willing to self-identify. The other proxy for race and ethnicity sometimes can be language. And increasingly, you know, it's people don't know what their race or ethnicity is, but they know what the ethnicity or race of their parents are. So, you know, you can ask questions subtly about how do your parents self-identify, which can tease out certain people who may have Afro-Indigenous ancestry. You can also use language in some cases as a proxy. If you yourself grew up speaking an Indigenous language, or you know, Garifan, or an Afro-descendant, Palenquero, or et cetera, you probably then have some identification with those communities. So there are these subtle ways of understanding race and ethnicity that are becoming increasingly, you know, creating very interesting results, and also showing that people do want to identify, but I think that at times they may be afraid of how that's perceived if it's very linked to their own personal data and to their experiences, whether it's in the workplace or in the healthcare system.
Yeah, Carlos, please.
Yeah, I would like to emphasize the fact that according to international standards, self-identification is the most important thing. Yeah. And what happened often in the region is actually that people don't ask the question, but they assume the ethnicity of the person, and that's very dangerous. And the other thing I would say is that usually, especially the household surveys or the national census, are the ones who are interviewing is the father or the mother of the house. So sometimes you ask the question to a person who may not self-identify himself as an Afro-descendant or Indigenous, but their kids may. So you're actually missing you know, population over there. So it's kind of tricky, you know. But what we have seen in the region is like the importance of self-identification, and that's still something. I mean, we have to sensitize our own people first. So, and you know, like what happened in Argentina and other places has been like some of the people who were conducting the census, they didn't ask the question because they felt like they may offend the person. Mm-hmm. And then so, you know, what we did actually, we empower people. So people were saying like, we're asking like, oh, you didn't ask me about the race. I want to answer that question. So, you know, there's like a lot of challenges, you know, That's basically.
Yeah, and I think too, you know, with the index itself, what you can see on these scorecards is you can look at, you know, how countries are doing by variable. If you want to look at, you know, race and ethnicity, creating this new ethno-racial inclusion variable, but also what we've done each year is have, you know, as you can see here, there's so much story behind these numbers, and the numbers really, I mean, it's a good exercise in terms of ranking, in terms of seeing how countries stack up and making report cards. But I think what's also important is to really look beyond the numbers and having these discussions. And also to that end, in our full magazine, in our summer issue of America's Quarterly, I don't believe they're in the inserts, but we have a section called Behind the Numbers. And so these are longer form articles that really take apart issues like women's rights, or Judith wrote a great piece on race and ethnicity issues. So you can actually get a little bit more information and take a deeper dive on some of these topics, because you know, it's great to have the numbers, but you also want to have more of the story as well there. A bunch of questions. So we'll start, I'll go here, and then we'll go to you. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Maria Moscoso. I'm a public policy fellow with the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute. Thank you all for being here. And my question is just mainly, how does the index deal with governments who aren't as responsive to data collecting? And are there any certain recommendations, like specific, that governments can take that the index provides to just promote social inclusion in these just countries in Latin America?
Sure, sorry, so was the question specific to the lack of government responsiveness?
Yes, like is there anything, exactly, like any recommendations that the index can provide?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think looking at some of the LAPOP data in terms of where citizens feel like their governments are responsive or not, I think it's actually a great indication for these countries to actually take a closer look and say, wow, you know, our citizenry is really, you know, not feeling like they're part of this political process, that the governments aren't responsive to their needs, and what that tells them in terms of the kinds of inclusive policies that they then should and can implement on the ground. I think an important exercise for this is to create the index, and then the next step is for countries to really respond to it and to really take that so they can create different policies in the future to respond to that. And like Liz was saying, there's some contradictions too in terms of like people feeling personally empowered, but maybe their government isn't as responsive to them. So looking at it, for that one indicator, but also looking at it, as a suite of other indicators to see what that really means. I don't know if you want to add to that, Mauricio.
I would add that it's not going to happen on its own. The governments aren't just going to automatically be responsive. One of the powerful effects here is that this is a tool for advocates and for citizens to organize to demand from their governments to get resources reallocated or women educated or whatever it is. And so I think that is really going to be the benefit that we see here. Most governments are not going to automatically respond to the fact that they're not responsive already. And that's really the ball game in these countries, getting the governments to provide for their people and be responsive as possible.
I will go here. Oh, did anyone want to add to that? Sorry,
I just was going to add that I think that, to echo some of the comments earlier, that putting the countries in comparative perspective and establishing some rankings and dialogue around those is a really effective way to engage with the governments and put a little bit of pressure on those governments to enact policies. And so I think that the index does a nice job of sort of promoting this idea of a race to the top, right? Or at the very least, sort of nudging governments upward. And we've seen that in our dialogue with the English-speaking Caribbean countries. You mentioned sort of fall at the bottom when it comes to LGBT rights and tolerance, and we see that in our data, and we've had very effective, there's nothing like putting up a comparative chart and showing, your countries at the bottom, right, to instigate a dialogue and then, hopefully policy. So I think that that's one of the, primary sort of values in this index.
Absolutely. Thanks. So we'll go, we'll go here and then to you, and then we'll go around. Thanks, guys.
Good morning. Ryan Springer, independent consultant with Trident House International. One, I'd like to second the recommendation that we look at health indicators. I think access to health is an important factor in this. Second, have you guys thought of looking at the incarcerated population? And what does that look like in the countries and also returning citizens? What are the policies that support returning citizens coming back to the community? And second, is there any opportunity with this activity or something is happening in conjunction with it to look at these factors in the English-speaking Caribbean countries?
Thank you for the questions. I think they're all great. In terms of looking at incarcerated populations, that hasn't been something that we've looked at, and so thank you for that recommendation. And that's something, as I said, when we think about our 5-year anniversary and maybe changing the index up a little bit, that's something that's a huge issue for the region, and really looking at those topics is going to be important. I will say, separate from the index in our America's Quarterly magazine, that's a topic that we are going to be exploring with different articles and doing some journalistic reporting from the region, actually in that, perhaps not in our next issue of America's Quarterly, but in the one after. So I'll be sure to get your contact information so I can send you some of the reporting that we're going to be doing on that exact topic. And to answer the rest of your question on different policies in the region and returning folks to the region in terms of incarcerated populations. That's not something we have looked at with the index and something that we're going to be doing, but maybe that's something we could look more on. I know, Mauricio, you've worked in that in Central America. Have you guys worked on that issue?
And it's an important issue to look at. I don't know how, whether it would incorporate nicely into this,
yeah.
but it's an important issue.
Thank you. And I'll go here and then here. Thanks.
Thank you. I am Sergio Martinez, and I am from Guatemala. I am informated about what is the situation. But I have 3 questions. In this moment, I have 2 for Mauricio. And the first one is about what kind of efforts do you know could improve the civil society participation in order to ask demands for the government? For example, Guatemala has improving in the society since the the corruption scandals in this year in particular, and we are actually in the election process for the next president for the next 40 years. This is one. What kind of suggestions could you give to the Guatemala society? And the other question is about the intervention of CICIG in Guatemala about the make institutions stronger. What kind of strategies could be the programs addressed by this international organization like CICIG? And my third question is in general about the collecting data. It is difficult for the governments to collect data because the priorities is the kind of politics. For example, to allocate resources in order to for example, to satisfy some interest from every sector of society. But I am impressed by the idea, for example, if non-profit organizations could collect data instead of government, and what kind of a strategy could be addressed on the efforts between the international organizations and non-profits in collecting data instead of governments, for example, to make an official measures.
Well, thank you very much for your comments. In terms of, Guatemala is an interesting case in terms of the index because we are seeing that it has consistently ranked at the bottom. So I think that there's a lot of different types of programs that could, or different policies that could become in place in Guatemala to strengthen some of these areas. We're seeing that except Guatemala is consistently on the bottom of the indicators, except for places like civil society participation by gender, and that's actually very much at the top. But we're seeing low secondary school enrollment, low marginal increases in financial inclusion, and the percent living on more than $4 a day. But I think the answer is that it's exactly what you say. We need to have a host of different actors in these countries really working to address these issues. And I mentioned before, we had a business organization who is working with different community leaders on really addressing things like access to education, violence prevention, and participation from all different aspects of society. And that kind of work has really made an impact. But there are still many challenges that remain. There are a lot of really important different organizations and NGOs in the region working to address these issues. And so what the index, I think, helps do is highlight where these issues are and then really provides a backdrop for where these organizations can then take over and try to address these different areas, whether it's everything from living on more than $4 a day, or financial inclusion, or women's rights, government responsiveness, those types of issues.
Regarding your question about suggestions for civil society in Guatemala, we take our cues from them as opposed to giving suggestions about their effectiveness. We support Acción Ciudadana in Guatemala, which has been a key catalyst in highlighting issues of corruption, mobilizing citizens, demanding change. I think it's our role to be supportive and help them be stronger. Regarding your question on CICIG, putting aside your any kind of partisan political views about the role of UN agencies and how that is effective, the fact is that they have strengthened the overall capacity in that country to investigate corruption, right? So their presence has made those institutions and working with the Attorney General stronger, and that's a plus. And so I think that is an important example for the region. So I would just, hopefully that answers your question.
I just wanted to chime in very briefly on the notion of civil society groups collecting data. I think civil society groups can help validate data sets, but I think it's really important when we're thinking about official data. If we're talking about decisions around resource management or official policy at a macro level, at a federal government level, or national government level, you really need to have official statistics to do that. And they need to be longitudinal over time, and they need to be done with a certain level of technical rigor or quality. And I think the question that I would say is not that civil society should not try to collect data in the interim, but it's very important that at some point that becomes the state responsibility, in large part because many of these marginalized populations should not be responsible for writing their exclusion. It should be the responsibility of the government as a whole to really better understand what's happening with the population groups.
Yeah, I totally agree. We should not give them a pass at their responsibility to collect that data and use it.
And I think the other challenge that civil society groups often have, and going back to the notion of categories, is that they may, for different political reasons, it may be helpful to change categories. And I think that's part of the evolution. And there are many examples of social movements here in the US where definitions have changed over time. I'm thinking of the case of the African American community, go from black to Negro to black, et cetera. I mean, I think these are important discussions, but when civil societies are having the two discussions in the same space, I think it can be very, very confusing. The only other thing I want to say very quickly is to clarify, self-identification is the most important standard for collecting data. I think the challenge is that if we don't have good self-identification data, and if we're looking at household surveys that are not universal surveys, we sometimes have to look at other ways of gathering that information. So,
I would just like to add that, as I mentioned before, census is a political issue. So the governments have to do it because, I mean, there's a political reason, and it's like, like voters and, like the number of congressmen, et cetera. It depends on the population. So it's a political issue. I didn't want to talk about it because I'm more interested on resources being reallocated to people who have been excluded traditionally. But, and it's something that actually like governments have committed to do like every 10 years. And it's kind of an international standard that they have to do it every 10 years. And as I said before, I mean, in terms of social inclusion, it has not been very, very, very effective, so to speak. But for them, politically speaking, has been very effective. And believe me, they want to do it for political reasons.
Thank you. Liz, yes?
Just really quickly, I want to follow up on these comments to sort of echo them in a way and say that to collect good data takes a combination of really important elements, right? So one is skill and rigor and expertise. Another is local partnerships, just dialogue with civil society, with individuals in the countries, within the subgroups that you're interested in studying. And the other is, sort of those who might fund this work, right? So from our perspective, with the LAPOP America's Barometer surveys, we've really benefited tremendously from USAID's core support for the America's Barometer, but also from support from the Inter-American Development Bank, which has allowed us, and this gets back to the question that was raised a moment ago, to expand our survey work in the English-speaking Caribbean to an unprecedented degree. So hopefully in the future we can sort of do more with the Social Inclusion Index to look at that, to put a spotlight on that region. But thanks to the partnership that we've had with the IDB and and with USAID allowing us to do that.
Great. Yeah, I'm going to go here. I know you've had your hand up for a while, and then I'll come to you. Thanks.
Thank you. My name is Julio Guiti. I am from SUDAC Inc. I am also a member of the Garifuna community. We identify ourselves as Afro-Indigenous. First of all, I would like to thank every one of you for your leadership on the subject matter. Throughout the years, we have seen the work of Zakia, Carl Johnson, Judy Morrison, Carlos Quesada, among others. As you said before, this is not a relatively new issue. We saw the work that the Inter-American Dialogue did back in the days in terms of compiling data. We have been seeing the work of the Congressional Research Services. We have seen the work that the IDB did, particularly during the government of Enrique Iglesias, during his 2 cycles. And we also have seen the work that the World Bank has been doing throughout the years. My question is, I have 2 questions. The first question has to do with, do you have any recommendations with regard to how to expedite the practical application of the outcomes of the index throughout the multilateral development institutions like the World Bank and the IDB? Number 1. Number 2, there is an issue of perception in the region. I'm from Honduras, but I have been traveling throughout the whole Central American region throughout the years. What we see is that, or what some of the stakeholders on the ground see, is the fact that while we spend a significant amount of time compiling data, the rest of the world is moving up with energy projects, transportation and communication projects, water and sanitation projects, and is is we see that many of our communities won't exist, for instance, by 2050 due to the challenges associated with climate change. And a significant part of this data takes time to actually convert them into projects that can actually be executed. Some of the projects can take between 3 to 5 years, and I'm talking about a $500,000 project, not a $2 million project. So if you have any saying about it, we will highly appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your comments and questions. I think in terms to address the first question, I believe, was how to expedite the outcomes of the index to multilaterals and others. Just, are you saying getting the word out about the results of the index out across the region? So yeah, so we we have been working in the past to really disseminate this index as widely as possible, and I'm talking about in the DC policy circles like we are here today, and also throughout the region. In working with different folks like the State Department, it's really something that they can take into their different offices throughout the region as well and disseminate it that way. We work with different policymakers. We have relationships with different governments beyond the multilateral community in terms of them being able to see these results and either celebrate, as we said at the beginning from Susan, like Uruguay celebrating their first place, or other countries having to take a closer look. So we work across a wide variety of stakeholders, I would say, within the region, in DC, policy circles to get these outcomes out. I'm not sure if anyone wants to add in terms of recommendations for these.
I think we talk about data, but data's a lot of different things. And I think that LAPOP is an opinion survey. At the IDB, we work a lot with household surveys and census. We actually work more with household surveys than census, but the census is important because the census serves as the base for the sampling exercise for the household surveys. I think I think data on climate change is very important. I think it's very timely. I think it's necessary. I don't see these exercises as being completely separate, but I see them happening in parallel spaces. And just to give you a very concrete example, and this is an example actually from yesterday, because we have good population maps for concentration of Afro and Indigenous populations that's GIS mapped and referenced, we're now overlaying biodiversity zones and climate change maps on top of that. Very simple exercise. It's not done very much. Again, because there's almost this split that scientists, and you know this well, are looking at the scientific part and not necessarily thinking always about the people who occupy these regions. So just some simple crossing of data sets can give you maps that are very, very rich, that can demonstrate and alert that, hey, look, where the climate change is happening is in communities that are indigenous and Afro-descendant. And this is where the intervention needs to be made first. So I think, again, I'm not one to say, let's wait till the next census. Or the nice thing about the household survey, and I emphasize it because I think for many of the multilaterals, we use the household surveys very, very extensively, and they come out much more frequently. So you can almost tweak or adjust the household survey a little bit more quickly than you can a census instrument. But again, we know that sometimes the sampling isn't good, so we go back to the census, and we may look at even some community level data to validate, because again, the importance of validation is really key, and that data set can then be used to influence policy in the very short term. So I'd love to continue the conversation and talk to you a little bit more about that, because I don't see data as being the barrier for access. The reality is that what happens with big scale projects is often the absence of data is what prevents people from being engaged. So the process of collecting data shouldn't slow things down more. In fact, it should be finding and creating solutions. And increasingly, I'm looking at also with members of my team looking at econometric solutions. So is there something analytical in math and sampling that we can do that will help us overcome some of these challenges, precisely so that we don't have to wait for new data sets?
Carlos, and then
I like the question because there's one thing we need to understand. Our governments are conducting ongoing household surveys. Those are nationally, though. So they're sampling regions every single year. So next year, let's say in Peru, it's going to be the 3 southern states. The following year is going to be the other states. So in each country is the same. So I think the challenge for us is to include the self-identification question in all the gathering information techniques, not to wait 10 years to have the national census. So I'm just saying this because there also there is the agrarian census like it's like every 7 years or every 12 years, or it depends on the country. But we have like ongoing information coming out of the National Institute of Statistics. I think the challenge has been for us, from a civil society perspective, how to read that data and how to use that data in order to change policies. And to tell you the truth, and I'm glad that there's some funders here, is like, yeah, you know, civil society organizations also need money to actually learn how to read data. And in fact, in Peru right now, I'm going next week to Peru, because we're actually partnering with the National Institute of Statistics in Peru, where they are gonna train Afro-Peruvian leaders on how to read data. So we're not gonna wait until the census to understand how the census works. We're gonna start working with the household surveys right now, because there's always information. So what we have to make sure is that the question with, you know, like with the self-identification question, so to speak, that we want is included in the different kind of gathering information techniques.
That's great, and I also think too, you know, the more that those are getting updated in the region, the more that there's more data to collect, then we, you know, the index is a great way to compile all of that data into one, you know, one report card where you can actually see the impact of that data, you know, on an index, to see if that's going to move countries up or down, to see if the participation of these different communities, to see if the census data is really going to make an impact. So I think it's a nice way to really have all of the proactive work that groups and other organizations are doing on the ground in Peru and Colombia and all of these countries, and then have the index actually hopefully reflect that with updated numbers on these household survey data that we put into the index. We have time for the one last question here, and then we'll have to end the discussion after that. Thanks.
Hi, thank you for everything. Franco Bastida, Latin American Rights and Security Fellow at Center for International Policy. I had two really basic questions. The first one is, we talked about how to get the social inclusion index out there and how it could serve as tools for advocacy groups and civil society. So for policymakers and the government, how should they read this index? What are some recommendations for them? And the second one is, we mentioned about, I don't know, certain constraints that still exist that touch on levels of violence, whether it's gender discrimination, whether it's discrimination based on sexual orientation. What about the ways in which violence is factored in the social inclusion index? For example, public spaces, the recreational use of public space. That's an indication of social inclusion for social mobility. So would there be the possibility of public safety or public perception of safety for the social inclusion index?
Thank you. Two very good questions with not much time to respond to them. Very quickly, I'll take a quick stab and then can pass it down. In terms of how this index should be read by governments, you know, I think I really like the page that you can see in the inserts that has all of the rankings by variable. You can, you know, look to see where your country is falling in terms of everything from LGBT rights to financial inclusion to women's rights to government responsiveness, as we talked about, civil rights, political rights, GDP spent on social programs. It's a very clear snapshot of how your government is faring in relation to all of these different areas. And I think that there's more public pressure now for, you know, really incorporating different aspects into legislation to protect for greater rights for women, to protect for greater LGBT, you know, freedom from discrimination, and things like that. In terms of the constraints that, and very quickly in terms of the violence, then I'll pass it on. What we have done in the past, actually, I believe it was 2 years ago, we actually took a ranking of the top, homicides in each country per 10,000 inhabitants, and we actually took the rates of violence and compared it to levels of social inclusion in each of those countries. And what we saw was a very strong, you know, not that correlation is causation, but we saw a very strong relationship between very high levels of violence and low levels of social inclusion in each of these countries. And I think, that's a really important, safety and violence is a really important indicator to be looking at. And so again, as I say this with the other questions as well, as we look to update our index in this 5th year anniversary, as we look to other indicators as well, I think something like violence will be very important as we've looked at in the past, but even looking more deeply. We have a few more minutes. I don't know if we want to go, if anyone else has
Well, I'll just
comments.
say, you're right. Citizen security is a cross-cutting issue, and I think the analysis in last year's report that kind of looked at how that affects the other variables is really important, and it's probably worth doing again. In terms of, I think governments will respond in different ways. There will be governments that embrace the results as a chance for change, and there might be some that are going to stonewall, and demand more citizen action. But, I think having the baseline, having the comparative analysis is going to get the conversation started, and that's really the goal here.
I just wanted to say that I think georeferencing data and working with academics, civil society groups, society as a whole to discuss how to use the data is key. We know that we've been working with the governments of Brazil. We've done some work as well on an oversampling survey in Peru on African descendants. We know that there is data available. We know that sometimes it's not always accessible, and doing things like georeferencing data sets can really show a much clearer picture. We know that increasingly infographics are being used. People are not necessarily reading long reports. So to be able to have these visual tools in a very accessible format, I think will change the policy discussion, the allocation of resources, the inclusion of excluded communities in discussions. And the other thing that we've done, and on my team, I'm very pleased that we have someone who's working full-time who's a big data specialist and also a programmer, more importantly. And we've adapted several free and open source software tools that enable you to do visualizations and do some of this GIS mapping. So it's not that it's not accessible to local people. And I want to give you just a very quick example that I heard about last December. I was talking with an indigenous community that's not far from Cali, Colombia, and they wanted to get a drone to be able to map their community. First of all, they wanted to get a satellite image, and it was way too expensive. Then they decided they wanted to get a drone, which was also too expensive. They decided to mount a camera on a toy helicopter and did a map of their entire community that's theirs, that they own. And they're doing data analysis and overlays and georeferencing information about their own communities based on a tool that probably cost them less than $75. So you'd be surprised that data, I think, in a lot of ways unlocks discussions on policy, and being able to, again, visualize and see the data, whether it's on a map or a chart or a graph, is really transforming the discussion. And I think the popularization of these tools is going to make the discussion even more rich. So I don't think we should be afraid and think of data as always an exclusionary factor. I think it can really be used to empower local communities.
Very quickly, just to mention that there is a correlation between violence, poverty, and racism, especially against Afro-descendant communities across Latin America. And, and only few countries are actually collecting that data. Brazil is collecting that data, forced by civil society, but at least it's collecting that data. In terms of LGBT, and we don't have time here, but when we call, as the UN call it, aggravated forms of discrimination, that same correlation when you're talking about LGBT people, if you're a transgender woman in Brazil and you're Black, the chances that you're gonna be killed are way higher than if you're white, a white transgender woman. So, and just to mention two kind of good examples in Latin America, the Alcaldía de Bogotá, like the mayor of Bogotá, had created like a zona de tolerancia, like a tolerance zone for LGBT people called Chapinero, where actually the police protect LGBT people. And Rio de Janeiro has a program called Rio Sem Homophobia, like Rio Without Homophobia, where actually there's like the authorities are trying to create certain areas, like safety areas for LGBT people. Unfortunately, those areas are in the richest part of Rio, which is Copacabana and Ipanema. Yeah.
Liz, any last words?
No, just thank you.
Okay. Well, I just just want to say, the Social Inclusion Index, when we come to DC every year and discuss this, we have some of the richest conversations with not only our experts of panelists this year with Mauricio and Judith and Carlos and Liz, and for all of your collaborations and support, especially from the Seattle International Foundation. But also, it's great getting a chance to talk with all of you, experts in all of these different areas. And every year we come away with great ways in which we can think about these issues more deeply, in which we can incorporate some of these issues and collaborate possibly as well with some of you in the audience that we haven't previously collaborated with. So I want to give a huge round of applause again to our panelists, and thanks to everyone for being here on the launching of our index. Thanks.